She laughed and told everyone I was broke, sitting right there at her family's table, as if I were invisible. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the polished dining table, how it made everything look warm and welcoming, the kind of setting where families were supposed to feel safe, respected, connected. But that night it only made the humiliation sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore. Olivia didn't even lower her voice when she said it, her tone light, almost playful, as if she were sharing an amusing fact instead of stripping me of dignity in front of a room full of strangers who suddenly felt entitled to look at me with quiet judgment. A few of them chuckled softly, others exchanged glances, and one woman across the table tilted her head in that polite but unmistakable way people do when they've already decided who you are. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture straight, my expression calm, because I had learned a long time ago that reacting in moments like these only gives people exactly what they expect. My son, Daniel, didn't say a word. He didn't defend me, didn't even look at me. He just reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip, as if what had just been said was too small to deserve acknowledgement. That silence was louder than anything Olivia could have said. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his life now. The room carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, forks clinking against plates, glasses refilling, polite conversations weaving around the moment that had just carved itself into me. I noticed the details, the way Olivia's mother gave a tight smile, the way her father leaned back in his chair with a look of quiet approval, as if my supposed lack of worth somehow validated their daughter's choices. I let my gaze drift across the room slowly, taking it all in, not because I was hurt in the way they might have expected, but because I was observing, measuring, understanding. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they hold power over you. I picked up my napkin and gently placed it beside my plate, my movements unhurried, controlled. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice steady enough that no one could hear the shift happening beneath it. "No." One stopped me as I stood. No one asked if I was all right. That, more than anything, confirmed what this dinner had become. As I walked out of the dining room, I could still hear Olivia laughing behind me, the sound bright and careless, echoing down the hallway like something that didn't belong in a home. The air felt different once I stepped away from the table, cooler, quieter, honest. I paused briefly near the entryway, my hand resting against the smooth surface of the wall, and allowed myself a single breath that was deeper than the ones I had taken all evening. It wasn't sadness that settled in me. It was clarity. For years, I had watched the small shifts, the subtle changes in tone, the way conversations would stop when I entered a room, the way decisions were made without including me, always explained afterward as something minor, something I wouldn't need to worry about. I had let it pass, again and again, because I believed in patience, in giving people the chance to show kindness without being forced into it. But patience has a way of revealing truth, not changing it. By the time I reached the front door, I understood that this moment wasn't sudden. It was the result of every quiet dismissal that had come before it, every time I had chosen silence over confrontation. I opened the door and stepped outside, the night air cool against my skin, carrying with it a stillness that felt more real than anything inside that house. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. Behind me, the dinner continued, unaware that the story they thought they were telling about me had already begun to turn in a direction they would never see coming. Because what Olivia didn't know, what none of them knew as they sat comfortably inside those walls, was that nothing about my life was as simple as they believed, and the foundation they felt so secure standing on wasn't theirs to begin with. I sat in my car for a long moment after closing the door, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as the quiet settled around me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. The house behind me still glowed with warm light, the kind that suggested comfort and belonging, but I knew better now. That light did not extend to me. It had not for a long time. I watched the silhouettes moving past the windows, shadows crossing back and forth, glasses lifting, heads tilting in laughter, as if nothing of consequence had happened, as if I had simply stepped out for a breath of air and would return at any moment to resume my place at the table. But I did not start the engine. Instead, I leaned back slightly and let the silence stretch, allowing my thoughts to settle into something clearer, something sharper than emotion. Moments like these do not begin where they appear to. They are built slowly, piece by piece, over years of small dismissals that seem insignificant on their own. I could trace it back if I wanted to. The first time Olivia had corrected me in my own kitchen, her tone light but firm, explaining how things should be done now. The way Daniel had laughed it off, calling it helpful. The holidays that slowly shifted away from my home to hers, always with a reasonable explanation, always temporary until it was not. The decisions that no longer included me, only informed me afterward, as if I were a guest in a life I had once built from the ground up. I had told myself it was normal. That families change. That roles evolve. That love remains even when habits do not. But sitting there in the quiet of my car, I realized that love does not erase respect. And respect had been disappearing long before tonight. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not yet, but simply to hold it, to feel the weight of something steady in my hand. There was a time when I would have gone back inside, would have smiled, would have found a way to smooth over the discomfort so that everyone else could remain comfortable. That had been my role for most of my life. To maintain peace. To absorb tension before it spread. But peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is permission. I glanced once more at the house, at the windows that framed a life that no longer included me in any meaningful way, and I felt something settle firmly into place. Not anger, not even sadness. It was understanding, clean and undeniable. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life. With a soft hum, and pulled away from the curb without hesitation. The road stretched ahead, familiar and steady, leading me back to the place I had lived in for decades, the place that still held every memory that mattered. As I drove, the rhythm of the streetlights passing overhead created a quiet pattern, one that gave space for reflection without pulling me backward. I thought about Daniel as a boy, the way he used to reach for my hand without thinking, trusting that I would always be there. That instinct had not disappeared overnight. It had been replaced, gradually, by something else. Influence. Distance. Choices made in rooms where I was no longer invited. I had wondered, more than once, when that shift had become permanent. Now I knew. It was not a single moment. It was a series of them, unnoticed until they formed something solid. By the time I turned into my driveway, the house stood exactly as I had left it that morning, quiet, still, unchanged by the events of the evening. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books grounding me instantly. This space had never made me feel like I needed to earn my place in it. It had never questioned my worth. I set my purse down carefully and walked through the living room, my fingers brushing lightly against the back of a chair that had been in the same spot for years. Everything here had a history. Everything here had been built with intention. And yet, even here, I could see the signs of recent changes. Papers moved. Items reorganized. Small adjustments made without asking. I paused near the hallway table where a stack of documents had been left slightly out of alignment. I straightened them absent-mindedly, my eyes catching on a name printed neatly across the top page. It was not mine. I did not react immediately. Instead, I placed the papers back exactly as they had been and stood there for a moment longer, letting the realization settle without rushing it. Tonight had not been the beginning. It had simply been the moment everything became impossible to ignore. And as I stood there in the quiet of my own home, I understood something with complete certainty. Whatever they believed about me, whatever story they had chosen to tell in that dining room, it was built on assumptions that would not survive what was coming next. I did not sleep that night, not because my mind was racing, but because everything had finally gone still in a way that demanded attention. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows thoughts to rise without interruption, and I let them come one by one, not pushing them away, not softening them with excuses the way I used to. I sat at the kitchen table long before sunrise, a single lamp casting a soft circle of light across the surface, and in that small space, everything felt precise, almost surgical. I reached for the stack of documents again, the ones I had noticed the night before, and this time I allowed myself to look more closely. The paper was crisp, recently printed, the ink still dark and clear, and the name that had caught my attention was there again, placed confidently where mine should have been. Olivia. Not handwritten, not added as a note. Printed, formal, deliberate. I traced the edge of the page lightly with my fingers, not out of hesitation, but to steady the realization forming beneath the surface. This was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision that had already been made, quietly, without my knowledge, in a room I had not been invited into. I turned the page slowly, scanning the lines with the kind of focus that comes when something matters enough to see clearly. Legal language has a rhythm to it, one I had grown familiar with years ago, and it does not leave much room for interpretation. Transfer, authorization, control. Words that do not appear unless someone intends them to mean exactly what they say. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the paper rest on the table as I considered the path that had led here. The small changes, the polite suggestions, the gradual removal of my involvement in things that once required my approval. Each moment had seemed minor on its own, easy to dismiss in the name of harmony. But together, they formed a pattern that was no longer subtle. It was structured, intentional. I stood and walked toward the living room. The early morning light just beginning to filter through the windows, soft and pale against the familiar furniture. This house had always been more than a place to live. It was a record of choices, of effort, of years spent building something stable enough to last beyond a single lifetime. And yet, somewhere along the way, someone had begun to treat it as if it were simply available, something that could be reassigned, redefined, without consequence. I stopped near the bookshelf where old photographs were arranged carefully, images of years that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. Daniel as a child, standing proudly with a science project he had insisted on finishing himself. My husband beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, his expression steady and certain in a way that had always grounded me. We had built everything together with a shared understanding that certain things would never need to be questioned. That trust had been the foundation. And now, I could see how easily it had been assumed, then quietly redirected. I returned to the kitchen and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had not needed to use in quite some time. It had been there all along, unchanged, waiting. I paused for a moment, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. This was the point where silence would no longer serve any purpose. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing on the other end. When the voice answered, calm and professional, I did not raise mine to match it. I spoke evenly, clearly, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. I explained that I needed a full review of all current property and asset documents, every transfer, every authorization, every change that had been filed within the last year. There was a brief pause, the kind that signals understanding rather than confusion, and then a simple acknowledgement. It would be handled. I ended the call and set the phone down gently, the motion deliberate, final in a way that required no announcement. Outside, the sun had risen fully now, casting a steady light across the room, illuminating everything without distortion. I looked once more at the documents on the table, at the name that had been placed where mine belonged, and I felt no urgency to react, no need to confront immediately. That would come later, at the right time, in the right setting, where the truth would not need to be explained because it would be impossible to deny. For now, it was enough to know that what had been set in motion without me would not continue that way. Not anymore. By mid-morning, the house no longer felt like a place of uncertainty, but a place of quiet preparation, the kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything beneath the surface. I moved through each room with the same steady pace, noticing details I had once overlooked, not because they were hidden, but because I had chosen not to examine them too closely. The guest room that had slowly become Olivia and Daniel's preferred space during visits, rearranged to suit their comfort without ever asking. The study where files had been shifted into new folders, labeled in a handwriting that was not mine. Even the kitchen, where small appliances had been replaced with newer ones I had never purchased, as if someone had begun redesigning my life one object at a time. None of it had happened overnight. That was the part that mattered. This was not chaos. It was a plan carried out patiently, relying on the assumption that I would continue to look the other way. I paused near the window, overlooking the backyard, the grass still damp from the early morning dew, the fence line straight and familiar. This property had been ours for over 30 years, every improvement made deliberately, every addition considered carefully. I could still remember the day we signed the original papers, the weight of the pen in my hand, the way my husband had smiled, as if we were securing something that would outlast both of us. In many ways, we had. What we had not accounted for was how easily that stability could be taken for granted by someone who had never been part of building it. I returned to the dining table and sat down again, placing the documents neatly in front of me, aligning the edges with precision. Order has a way of clarifying thought. The call I had made earlier would take time to produce results, but I did not need confirmation to understand what I was seeing. What I needed now was patience. Reacting too quickly would only give them time to adjust, to explain, to reshape the narrative in ways that would make everything seem harmless, temporary, even beneficial. I had seen that pattern before. It always came wrapped in reasonable language, in concern, in the suggestion that everything was being done for my sake. I reached for a pen and wrote down a short list, not of emotions, but of facts. Dates, names, documents that needed to be reviewed, conversations that needed to happen, but not yet. Writing them down did not make the situation heavier. It made it clearer. Across from me, the empty chair seemed to hold a presence that had not faded with time, a reminder of the standard I had lived by for decades. We had never made decisions like this without speaking to each other, without ensuring that both voices were heard. That absence was not just emotional. It was structural. It had created a space that others had quietly stepped into, assuming that silence meant permission. I set the pen down and folded my hands again, not in hesitation, but in readiness. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the sound fading just as quickly as it had come. The world continued, unchanged, unaware of the shift taking place within these walls. And that was exactly how it needed to be. There was no advantage in announcing what I knew, no benefit in confronting them before I had everything in place. Truth is most effective when it arrives complete, when there is no room left for interpretation or denial. I stood once more and walked toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the mirror mounted near the entrance. I looked at my reflection, not searching for reassurance, but confirming what I already understood. I did not look like someone who had lost control. I did not look like someone who needed to be managed or spoken for. If anything, I looked exactly as I had always been, only now with a clarity that could not be undone. The phone remained on the table behind me, silent, waiting. It would ring soon enough, and when it did, it would bring the kind of information that changes conversations permanently. Until then, there was nothing left to question. What had been set in motion without me was nearing its end, and when the time came to address it, it would not be done with raised voices or emotional appeals. It would be done with precision, with facts, and with a calm that would leave no doubt about where everything truly stood. The call came just after noon, right when the sunlight had shifted to its brightest point, filling the house with a clarity that left no shadows to hide in, and I answered it on the first ring, not out of urgency, but because I had been expecting it. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, the same voice that had handled matters for my family for years without ever needing to explain its competence, and as he began to speak, I listened without interrupting, letting each detail settle into place with the same calm I had carried since the night before. There had been changes, he confirmed, multiple filings over the past 6 months, all structured carefully, all presented in a way that would appear routine to anyone not looking closely. Authorizations submitted under the assumption of consent, signatures that aligned just enough to pass without immediate concern, transfers that did not move ownership outright, but positioned control in a way that could be shifted fully with one final step. It was not reckless. It was deliberate. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I had already understood. I thanked him without asking unnecessary questions and requested full copies of everything, every document, every signature, every timeline, because details matter when truth needs to stand on its own. When the call ended, I did not move right away. I remained seated, the phone still in my hand, feeling the quiet weight of confirmation settle over what had already become clear. Outside, a breeze moved lightly through the trees, the leaves shifting in a way that made no sound inside the house, as if the world itself was respecting the stillness of the moment. I placed the phone down carefully and stood, walking toward the window once more, not to look for answers, but to consider what came next. This was the part most people misunderstand. They believe that once the truth is known, action should follow immediately, that confrontation is the natural response, that exposing everything at once brings resolution. But resolution is not built on reaction. It is built on timing. If I spoke now, if I called Daniel, if I demanded explanations, they would respond exactly as expected. There would be confusion, denial, carefully chosen words designed to soften the edges of what had been done. It would become a conversation instead of a conclusion. And I had no interest in conversation anymore. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the table, gathering the documents into a single, neat stack, aligning them once more as if order itself were part of the preparation. Then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I opened the drawer where I kept older files, the ones that had not needed to be reviewed in years because they had been built correctly the first time. I pulled out the original trust documents, the ones my husband and I had signed together, and placed them beside the newer papers. The difference was immediate, not just in the ink or the formatting, but in the intention behind them. One set was built on agreement, on clarity, on mutual understanding. The other was built on assumption, on quiet maneuvering, on the belief that no one would notice until it was too late. I flipped through the pages slowly, not because I needed to read every word again, but because I wanted to confirm what I already knew. The foundation had not changed. It had been adjusted around the edges, tested, pushed, but not yet broken. That final step they were preparing for had not been completed. Not yet. I closed the folder gently and placed my hand on top of it, feeling the solid weight of something that still belonged exactly where it was meant to be. That was when I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible shift in expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but recognition. They had been careful, but not careful enough. And that meant the outcome was no longer uncertain. I moved through the house once more, this time not observing, but preparing, making small adjustments that would not be noticed individually, but would matter when everything came together. A document placed in a different file. A key returned to its original location. A note written and left where it would be found at the right moment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would draw attention before it was time. Because when the moment came, it would not rely on explanation. It would rely on evidence, on structure, on the quiet certainty of facts that could not be argued with. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, the house felt different again, not because anything visible had changed, but because everything invisible had shifted into place. I stood near the doorway, looking out at the same street I had driven down the night before, and understood with complete certainty that the next time we all sat at a table together, the balance of that room would not belong to them. It never had. They had simply mistaken silence for absence, and now, that misunderstanding was about to be corrected in a way they would not be able to ignore. The following morning arrived without urgency, the kind of steady progression of time that does not rush events, but allows them to unfold exactly as they should, and I moved through my routine with the same calm precision that had settled into me the day before. Coffee brewed quietly in the kitchen, the soft hum filling the space without demanding attention, and I poured a single cup, carrying it to the table where the documents remained exactly as I had left them. Nothing had been disturbed. Nothing had shifted. That, in itself, was a confirmation. They had not yet realized that anything had changed. I sat down and opened the folder again, not to search for something new, but to review what I already understood with the clarity that comes from distance rather than emotion. Each page told the same story in a different form, one of gradual repositioning, of authority being redirected through channels that were meant to appear routine. It was careful work. That was undeniable. But careful does not mean complete, and it certainly does not mean irreversible. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle, grounding the moment in something simple and controlled. Outside, the morning light stretched across the yard, illuminating every detail without distortion, and I found myself appreciating that clarity in a way I had not before. There is a difference between seeing and understanding. I had seen these changes happening over time, but now I understood their intention fully, and that understanding made all the difference. My phone remained silent, which was exactly what I expected. Daniel had not called. Olivia had not reached out. There had been no follow-up to the previous evening, no attempt to smooth over what had been said, no message framed as concern or explanation. That absence was not surprising. It was consistent. People who believe they hold control rarely feel the need to justify their behavior. They assume acceptance. They assume compliance. I set the cup down and reached for another document, one that outlined access permissions, and I read it more closely this time, paying attention not just to what it allowed, but to what it did not. There were limits written into the structure, boundaries that could not be crossed without explicit authorization, and those boundaries had not been removed. They had only been approached, tested, positioned against. That distinction mattered. It meant that the final step, the one that would have shifted everything beyond recovery, had not been taken. Not yet. I closed the folder again and leaned back slightly, considering the timing of everything. 6 months of quiet adjustments. Weeks of increased confidence. A public display of dismissal that suggested they believed the outcome was already secure. That was where they had miscalculated. Confidence without confirmation leads to exposure. I stood and walked toward the front window, resting my hand lightly against the frame as I looked out at the street. A delivery truck passed slowly, stopping 2 houses down, the driver stepping out with a package in hand, moving with the kind of routine efficiency that comes from repetition. Life continues, regardless of what is unfolding beneath the surface. That continuity has always been something I respected. It keeps people grounded. It keeps them from reacting too quickly, from making decisions that cannot be undone. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the hallway, stopping briefly at the small cabinet where a set of keys was kept. I opened it and looked inside, confirming what I already suspected. One key was missing, not misplaced, not forgotten, taken. I closed the cabinet gently and let my hand rest against it for a moment longer than necessary, not out of frustration, but out of acknowledgement. Another piece of the pattern. Another indication of how far they believed they could go without being noticed. I moved through the rest of the house with the same steady pace, making no sudden changes, leaving everything as it appeared to be, because appearances matter when timing is involved. By the time I returned to the kitchen, the coffee had cooled slightly, but I finished it anyway, not because I needed it, but because I do not leave things incomplete. The phone would ring again soon. Documents would arrive. Conversations would be arranged. But none of that required urgency. What mattered now was alignment. Everything needed to be in place before anything was revealed. I gathered the papers once more and placed them neatly into the folder, closing it with a quiet finality that did not need to be spoken aloud. Then I set it aside, out of immediate view, not hidden, but not presented either. The difference is subtle, but important. I took one last look around the room, at the familiar surfaces, the unchanged details, and allowed myself a single, quiet realization. They believed they were moving toward control. In reality, they had only revealed their intentions. And once intentions are clear, outcomes are no longer uncertain. They are simply a matter of time. It was late afternoon when the second call came, the kind that does not interrupt your day, but quietly confirms that everything has aligned exactly as expected, and I answered it from the living room, standing near the window where the light had begun to soften into something warmer, something that made the house feel settled rather than exposed. The voice on the other end did not need to explain much this time. The documents had been reviewed in full, every filing traced, every authorization verified against the original structure that had been established years ago. There had been attempts to reposition control, to create pathways that could eventually lead to a complete transfer, but none of it had been finalized. Not legally, not completely. The safeguards that had been put in place long ago were still intact, and more importantly, they could not be bypassed without my direct involvement. I listened carefully, asking only one question when he finished, not about what had been done, but about what could still be done if no action was taken. The answer was simple. If left alone, the process would continue. If addressed now, it would stop immediately, and any unauthorized changes could be reversed without complication. I thanked him again, this time with a quiet certainty that did not need elaboration, and ended the call. For a moment, I remained where I was, the phone still in my hand, the silence of the room settling around me like something deliberate. This was the moment most people would choose to act quickly, to call, to confront, to demand explanations that would only lead to carefully constructed responses. But clarity does not require urgency. It requires control. I set the phone down on the small table beside me and walked slowly through the living room, my gaze moving across the familiar space, not searching, but confirming. Everything remained exactly as it should be, not because nothing had changed, but because I had allowed it to appear that way. That was the advantage of patience. It creates a false sense of stability for those who rely on it. I moved toward the front hallway and paused near the door, my hand resting lightly against the handle without opening it. I thought briefly of the dinner from the night before, of the way Olivia had spoken with such confidence, such ease, as if the conclusion had already been reached, as if my place in that room had already been decided without the need for my presence. That kind of confidence does not come from evidence. It comes from assumption, and assumptions are fragile when they are tested. I turned away from the door and returned to the dining table, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the same measured calm that had carried me through each step of the day. The folder was where I had left it, closed, unassuming, holding everything that would soon shift the balance of an entire conversation. I opened it once more, not to review the details again, but to prepare for what would come next. Timing matters, but so does setting. This would not be handled privately, not in a quiet phone call or a closed room where words could be reshaped or dismissed. It would be addressed in the same kind of space where it had been dismissed the night before. Publicly, clearly, without room for interpretation. I reached for my phone again and scrolled through my contacts until I found Daniel's name, my finger resting lightly above it for a brief moment before I pressed a call. The line rang longer than usual, a small detail that might have gone unnoticed before, but now it registered as part of a larger pattern. When he answered, his voice carried a casual tone, as if nothing had shifted, as if the previous evening had been just another dinner, just another conversation without consequence. I did not mirror that tone. I kept mine steady, even, leaving no space for misunderstanding. I told him I would like to host dinner the following evening, here, at the house. I did not explain why. I did not reference what had been said. I simply extended the invitation in a way that did not sound optional. There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough to suggest that he was considering something, perhaps wondering if there was more beneath the request, but he agreed without asking further questions. Olivia would come as well. That was expected. I ended the call with a simple acknowledgement and set the phone down once more, the motion as deliberate as everything else that had been set in place. The room remained quiet, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that stillness, everything had shifted into alignment. The next evening would not be a continuation of what had already happened. It would be a correction, and unlike the night before, this time, nothing would be left to assumption. The next evening arrived with a quiet precision, the kind that does not announce itself but settles into place exactly as expected, and I prepared the table with the same care I had always given to moments that mattered, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I understood the weight of setting. The plates were aligned evenly, the silverware placed with intention, the lighting soft but clear enough that nothing could be hidden behind shadow or distance. There is a certain clarity that comes when everything is visible, when nothing can be misinterpreted as accidental. I moved through the kitchen slowly, finishing the last details without rushing, allowing the calm I had carried all day to remain intact. When the doorbell rang, I did not pause. I walked to the door and opened it with the same composed expression I had held the night before, but this time there was no uncertainty beneath it. Daniel stood there first, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he believed this was a simple invitation, something ordinary, something that required no caution. Olivia stood just behind him, her expression composed, almost pleasant, as if the previous evening had already been set aside, as if whatever had been said no longer mattered. That, too, was expected. I stepped aside and let them enter without comment, closing the door quietly behind them. The house felt different with them inside, not because they had changed, but because I had. We moved toward the dining room with minimal conversation, the kind that fills space without adding meaning, and they took their seats without hesitation, settling into the same positions they had occupied before, as if the arrangement itself confirmed something in their favor. I took my seat last, folding my hands lightly on the table, my gaze steady, not confrontational, but direct enough that neither of them could ignore it. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate. Olivia was the first to break it, her voice carrying that same light tone, that same confidence that had filled the room the night before, making a casual remark about how nice it was to have dinner here again, as if familiarity could erase what had already been revealed. Daniel nodded in agreement, adding something about how it had been too long. his words easy, unexamined, as if repetition could make them true. I listened without interruption, allowing the rhythm of their voices to settle before responding. Then, without raising my voice, without shifting my posture, I reached beside me and placed the folder gently in the center of the table. The movement was small, but it changed everything. Both of them noticed it immediately, their attention shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Olivia's smile held for a fraction of a second longer than it should have, then adjusted slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal that she understood this was not part of a normal evening. Daniel glanced between the folder and me, his expression shifting from casual to uncertain, not yet aware of what it contained, but aware that something had changed. I opened the folder slowly, turning it so that the documents faced them, not rushing, not emphasizing any single page, allowing the structure of what was in front of them to speak for itself. There is a difference between telling someone the truth and placing it directly in front of them. One invites response. The other leaves no room for it. I reviewed everything this morning, I said, my voice even, measured, carrying no accusation, only fact. All the filings, all the authorizations. I paused briefly, not to create tension, but to ensure that every word was heard clearly, without distortion. Olivia's posture shifted slightly, her hands moving closer together on the table, a small adjustment that would have gone unnoticed before, but now stood out as part of a pattern I could see fully. Daniel leaned forward, his attention fixed on the documents, scanning the pages quickly, his expression tightening as recognition began to form. I did not need to point to anything specific. The details were clear enough on their own. The names, the dates, the structure that had been built quietly, piece by piece, under the assumption that it would not be questioned. Nothing has been transferred. I continued, my tone unchanged. Not legally. Not completely. The words settled into the room with a weight that did not require emphasis. Olivia did not speak immediately. She looked at the documents, then at me, her expression carefully controlled, but the confidence from the night before was no longer present. It had been replaced with something else. Calculation. Adjustment. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, as if creating distance would allow him to process what was in front of him more clearly. I closed the folder gently, placing my hand on top of it for a brief moment, not as a gesture of possession, but as a confirmation. This was not a discussion. It was a conclusion. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence as before. This time, it was not built on assumption. It was built on understanding, and that difference changed everything. Daniel was the first to speak, but his voice no longer carried the ease it had when he walked through the door. It was slower now, measured in a way that revealed he was choosing each word carefully, as if searching for a version of this moment that could still be controlled. He said my name quietly, not as a question, but as an attempt to re-establish something that had already shifted beyond his reach, and I looked at him without changing my expression, allowing the silence to remain just long enough for him to understand that this was not a conversation he could guide. Olivia did not interrupt him this time. She remained still, her eyes fixed on the closed folder, her posture composed but no longer relaxed. The confidence she had carried so easily before replaced with a stillness that suggested she was recalculating everything in real time. "It is not what you think," Daniel said finally. The sentence arriving exactly as expected, not because it was true, but because it was necessary for him to say it. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I unfolded my hands slowly and rested them on the table, my gaze steady, not confrontational, but clear enough that neither of them could mistake what was happening. "It is exactly what I think," I said, my voice calm, even, leaving no space for reinterpretation. There was no need to raise it. "The truth does not require volume." Daniel exhaled, leaning forward again, his hands pressing lightly against the edge of the table, as if grounding himself in something that no longer felt stable. He began to explain, speaking about intentions, about plans that were meant to simplify things, to make management easier, to prepare for the future, each phrase carefully constructed to sound reasonable, to soften the edges of what had been done. I listened without interruption, not because I needed to hear it, but because allowing someone to speak fully often reveals more than stopping them ever could. Olivia added to it then, her voice quieter than before, measured, controlled, suggesting that everything had been done with good intentions, that nothing had been finalized, that it was all preliminary, reversible, as if the absence of completion somehow erased the intention behind it. When she finished, the room fell silent again, but this time it was different. It was no longer uncertain. It was settled. I placed my hand lightly on the folder once more, not opening it again, not needing to, because everything that mattered had already been made clear. "You are right about one thing," I said, my tone unchanged, steady in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. "Nothing has been finalized." I paused briefly, not to create tension, but to allow the weight of that statement to settle fully. "And it will not be." The words did not land with force. They did not need to. They carried their own certainty, their own finality, and that was enough. Daniel's expression shifted then, not into anger, but into something quieter, something closer to realization, the kind that arrives when there is no longer a version of events that can be adjusted to fit expectation. Olivia did not speak. She held her composure, but the calculation behind her eyes had changed. It was no longer about control. It was about consequence. I leaned back slightly in my chair, maintaining the same calm posture I had held from the beginning, and for the first time, I allowed a small shift in tone, not emotional, but definitive. "This house," I said, my voice still even, still controlled. "Everything attached to it, every decision connected to it, was never yours to restructure." I did not emphasize the words. I did not need to. They were precise enough on their own. Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, his hands loosening their grip on the edge of the table, the tension that had held him there beginning to release, not because the situation had improved, but because it had become undeniable. Olivia finally looked up from the folder and met my eyes directly, and for a moment, there was no performance, no adjustment, only recognition of the position she had placed herself in. I held her gaze without challenge, without hostility, simply allowing the truth to exist between us without distortion. "You mistook silence for permission," I continued, my tone unchanged, the words placed carefully, deliberately. "And that was your only mistake." I stood then, not abruptly, not as a reaction, but as a natural conclusion to what had already been decided, and the movement itself shifted the room once more, signaling that there was nothing left to discuss. Neither of them stopped me. Neither of them spoke. I gathered the folder calmly and walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, unhurried, the same way they had been the night before, but this time there was no question about what they meant. As I reached the doorway, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge the finality of the moment in a way that required no words. Then I continued forward, leaving the room behind me, knowing with complete certainty that whatever they believed they had built quietly over the past months had already been undone, not with confrontation, not with emotion, but with something far more permanent: clarity.